An unforgettable exchange between a young boy and the President of the United States. One that moved an entire town to silence and left everyone reflecting on faith, loss, and hope. So sit back, open your heart, and get ready for a story that will inspire you in ways you never expected. The high school gymnasium in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had never been so packed. Rows of folding chairs covered the polished wooden floor, their metal legs scraping softly as latecomers squeezed into the remaining seats. The air buzzed with quiet murmurs, the occasional static from a reporter's microphone, and the whir of camera flashes. Normally, this space hosted basketball games or school assemblies, but tonight it had transformed into a town hall event featuring President Donald Trump. Championship banners hung from the rafters, reflecting the bright overhead lights, but tonight's pride wasn't about sports. It was about hearing one of the most powerful men in the country. Among the crowd, 11-year-old Ethan sat quietly beside his mother, gripping a worn spiral notebook, its cover creased from days of handling. He was one of the youngest in the audience, his small frame barely filling his chair, yet his presence carried a weight of its own. While the adults around him exchanged political chatter, Ethan remained still, focused. One question, one moment. He had practiced it for weeks, whispering it at night, tracing the words in his notebook until they felt like a prayer. His mother, a woman with hands hardened from years of tending crops, placed a gentle hand on his knee. "You don't have to do this," she murmured. She saw his hesitation, the way his fingers tightened around the notebook. Ethan swallowed hard and shook his head. "I want to," he whispered back. She gave him a small but knowing smile. "Then be brave, son." The energy in the room shifted as the event's moderator took the stage. The quiet murmurs transformed into applause, chairs shifting as people leaned forward. Then, a side door swung open, and Donald Trump entered. His familiar presence filled the room. He waved to the crowd, flashing his signature grin, the applause growing louder. Even skeptics felt the pull of his presence. Ethan, however, barely noticed. His heart thundered in his chest, drowning out the noise. As Trump stepped up to the podium, Ethan gripped his notebook tighter. His moment was coming. The question he had rehearsed for weeks was finally about to be spoken. The moment President Donald Trump stepped onto the stage, the energy in the gymnasium shifted. A wave of applause rippled through the crowd as people rose to their feet, some cheering enthusiastically, others offering polite but expectant nods. The overhead lights reflected off the polished hardwood floor, casting a warm glow over the podium, where the president now stood. Dressed in his signature navy suit and bright red tie, he adjusted the microphone, scanning the audience with a practiced gaze that had commanded far larger venues. "Great to be here in Cedar Rapids," he said, his voice steady and familiar. "Great people, hard-working people, the backbone of America." His words earned another round of applause, though there was a noticeable difference from his usual rallies. Tonight's crowd was smaller, more intimate, and filled with locals who weren't necessarily here for the spectacle, but rather to hear what he had to say. Trump launched into his opening remarks, touching on the topics he knew mattered to the people in the room: agriculture, small business growth, and the economy. He spoke about trade deals and tariffs, assuring the farmers in attendance that his administration was fighting for them. "We're bringing jobs back, making America strong again," he declared, his hands moving in the animated gestures that had become his trademark. People listened intently, but without the electric energy of a campaign event. For most, this wasn't about politics, it was about their livelihoods, their communities, and the challenges they faced every day. As he continued speaking, Ethan sat quietly in his chair, barely hearing the words. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the question he held in his notebook. His hands fidgeted with the corner of the page, his pulse quickening as he thought about the moment ahead. The president's words washed over him like background noise, blending into the occasional cheers and claps from the audience. And then, as expected, the moment came. "We're going to open it up for questions," Trump announced, stepping slightly away from the podium as a staff member positioned a microphone stand in the aisle. "Let's hear what's on your mind." Ethan's breath hitched. His moment had arrived. The gymnasium fell into an expectant hush as the first few people made their way to the microphone. A local farmer asked about trade policies, a retired teacher questioned education funding, and a small business owner inquired about tax breaks. Ethan listened, his heart pounding louder than the voices echoing through the hall. He gripped his notebook so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mother's reassuring hand rested lightly on his shoulder, but it did little to quiet the storm brewing inside him. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, practicing his words, imagining how he would stand, how he would speak. But now, as he looked at the microphone stand just a few feet away, his legs felt frozen in place. Then, as if sensing his hesitation, his mother gave him the smallest nudge. It was all he needed. Ethan inhaled deeply and stood. The movement caught the attention of a few people nearby, and the whispers started before he even reached the aisle. A child? The surprise rippled through the crowd as people shifted in their seats, curious about what he might ask. The microphone, too tall for him, was quickly adjusted by an event staffer, who offered him an encouraging nod before stepping back. Ethan's fingers trembled as he opened his notebook, but when he spoke, his voice, though small, carried through the silent gymnasium. "Mr. President, what does it mean to truly have faith?" The question hung in the air like an unexpected gust of wind, sweeping through the crowd and leaving a stunned silence in its wake. It was not about policy or politics. It was not about jobs or taxes. It was something deeper, something raw, something that made every person in that room pause and turn inward. For the first time that evening, Trump did not answer right away. His usual quick-witted responses and confident demeanor faltered, if only for a second. He looked at the boy, then at the notebook clutched tightly in his small hands, and something in his expression changed. His posture softened, his eyes no longer scanning the crowd but fixating solely on Ethan. A shift in the room was palpable. Even the staffers, typically poised and ready to move things along, seemed caught in the moment. What does it mean to truly have faith? It was a question that no debate, no policy briefing, no campaign rally could prepare him for. Trump exhaled, resting both hands on the podium as he finally spoke. "That's a big question, Ethan." His voice, though steady, carried something unexpected, a rare moment of vulnerability. The gymnasium, filled just moments ago with polite applause and murmured agreements, now felt like a church in prayer, silent, waiting. And as Trump prepared to answer, it was clear to everyone present, this night was no longer about politics. It was about something much more profound. For a man known for his confidence and sharp rhetoric, President Donald Trump's silence at that moment was striking. He stood at the podium, his gaze locked on Ethan, as though the boy's question had pulled something from deep within him, something untouched by politics or public image. What does it mean to truly have faith? It wasn't about policy or strategy, it was real, raw. And for the first time that evening, Trump seemed to set aside the script. He leaned forward, gripping the podium. "That's a big question, Ethan," he said, his voice quieter. He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." The crowd leaned in, hanging on his words. This wasn't a speech, this was reflection. His expression shifted, peeling back a side of himself rarely seen in public. "When I was your age," he began, "my parents took me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting there, staring at the stained glass windows, listening to the pastor talk about faith, about trusting God, and I believed it. I really did." He paused, glancing down as if searching for words. But life has a way of testing that belief. A few people nodded. They understood. Trump's gaze grew distant. "I had an older brother. His name was Fred. He was kind, funny, smarter than people gave him credit for. But he struggled." He took a breath. "Fred battled addiction, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help, it wasn't enough. One day we lost him." A heavy stillness settled over the gym. This was not the Trump they expected. "I was angry," he admitted. "Angry at him, angry at myself, and, if I'm being honest, angry at God because I didn't understand it. I thought, why would God take someone like Fred?" The weight of his words pressed down. A few people shifted in their seats, others discreetly wiped their eyes. For a long time, I didn't want to think about faith. I told myself life was about strength, about winning, about never letting anyone see weakness. That's how I got through it. He exhaled deeply, gripping the podium. But then, something changed. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night, I saw Fred's face in my mind, and he was smiling, that big, goofy smile of his, and I heard him say, "Don't be angry, Don. You've got work to do." Trump looked out at the audience, his expression softer now. I realized then that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting there's a reason, even when you can't see it, even when it doesn't make sense. A single sniffle broke the silence. People weren't just listening, they were feeling it. Trump turned back to Ethan. "So when you ask me what faith truly means, I'll tell you this. Faith isn't about certainty. It's about hope. It's believing in something greater than yourself, even when everything feels broken. It's about trusting there's a plan, even when you don't understand it." Ethan, gripping his notebook, swallowed hard. His young face reflected something far beyond his years. "Understanding?" Trump's voice softened. "And if you're wondering whether God hears you, Ethan, I think sometimes faith is just about listening. Maybe he's speaking to us in ways we don't always recognize." The gym remained utterly silent. Then, a single clap, followed by another, until the room erupted, not in the way of a political rally, but in something more meaningful, something deeper. For a moment the gymnasium remained still, as if Trump's words had settled over the crowd like a heavy snowfall. Quiet, profound, inescapable. A hand rose near the back of the room, and a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a face lined with years of hard work stood up. His plaid shirt was slightly wrinkled, his jeans worn from long days in the fields. He cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. "Mr. President," he began, "I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem?" Trump studied him for a moment before nodding. "I do," he said simply. "We don't like to talk about doubt. We don't like to talk about weakness. But faith? Faith isn't easy. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void. But I'll tell you something. The fact that you're still asking, still searching, that's faith in itself." The man slowly sat back down, his expression thoughtful. But the floodgates had opened. A woman with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun raised her hand next. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her words catching in her throat. "I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" Trump stepped away from the podium slightly, his gaze steady. "It's never too late," he said, his voice softer now. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes, it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it comes back." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening, and a few others in the crowd murmured in quiet agreement. This wasn't just a town hall anymore. It was a moment of collective reckoning, of shared vulnerability. A man in a veteran's cap was next. His voice was gruff, weathered by years of service. "I fought overseas," he said. "I saw things I'll never be able to forget. I used to pray every day, but after what I saw, I stopped. I haven't prayed in years." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy stone. Trump met his eyes, nodding slowly. "I won't pretend to know what you went through," he said, "but I know this. Faith isn't about never questioning. It's about not giving up on the possibility that there's still something worth believing in. And maybe, just maybe, that belief is still in you. You just have to give yourself permission to find it again." The veteran exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening, but he nodded. A small but powerful acknowledgement. And then Ethan spoke again. His voice, small but unwavering, broke through the heavy silence. "My grandpa used to say faith is like planting seeds," he said. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." The room stilled. Trump looked at him, and for the briefest moment something unguarded crossed his face. Something real. He nodded slowly. "Your grandpa sounds like a wise man, Ethan." And he was right. A quiet murmur swept through the crowd. The conversation that had begun as a political event had transformed into something deeply personal, something human. People were no longer just attendees, they were participants, connected by the simple truth that faith, in all its uncertainty, was something they all shared. As the room settled into a thoughtful stillness, all eyes turned to Ethan once again. The boy had remained at the microphone, his small frame looking even smaller under the weight of the moment, yet there was no hesitation in his eyes. He had listened intently as the adults around him spoke about loss, doubt, and the struggle to hold on to faith. And now, as the room waited, he tightened his grip on his notebook, inhaled deeply, and spoke words that no one expected. "My grandpa used to say, faith is like planting seeds," Ethan said, his voice steady despite his youth. "You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." The simplicity of his words struck the room like a quiet revelation. There was no grandeur in them, no theological complexity, just a truth so fundamental that it left the grown men and women in the audience shifting in their seats, as if suddenly seeing faith in a way they had long forgotten. Trump, who had spent much of the night delivering words of his own, suddenly found himself speechless. He studied the boy, and for the briefest moment something unguarded flickered across his face. Admiration, understanding, maybe even a kind of respect that one doesn't often see from a man so used to commanding every room he enters. He nodded slowly, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a different weight now, a softer edge. "Your grandpa sounds like a wise man, Ethan," and he was right. Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, but his expression was unreadable, not the face of a child basking in praise, but one who was simply speaking from the depths of something he believed. The crowd murmured in agreement, their expressions thoughtful. Ethan's words had settled over them like a warm breeze, a gentle reminder that faith isn't always about certainty or proof, it's about trust. It's about planting something, even when you don't know how or when it will grow. A woman in the front row, who had earlier spoken about losing her husband, wiped at her eyes. The farmer, who had questioned whether people were too afraid to admit their struggles, sat with his arms crossed, nodding to himself. And the veteran, who had confessed to losing his faith, let out a long breath, as if Ethan's words had cracked something open inside him. Trump turned back to the crowd, his usual bravado momentarily replaced with something more reflective. "This kid just reminded all of us of something important," he said, gesturing toward Ethan. "Faith isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just about believing in something, even when you can't see it yet." The gymnasium, which had begun the evening filled with political expectations, now felt transformed. What had started as a town hall meeting had become something far greater, a shared moment of reflection, vulnerability, and unexpected wisdom from the youngest voice in the room. President Trump stood at the podium, his gaze sweeping across the gymnasium, taking in the faces of those who had spoken, the farmer, the widow, the veteran, and most of all, Ethan, the boy who had changed the course of the evening. Trump let a brief silence hang in the air before he spoke again. "You know, there's something I've learned over the years," he said, his voice steadier now, more reflective. "Faith doesn't always show up in big moments. It's not just in churches or in prayers before a meal. It's in the small things, in kindness, in courage, in the way we show up for each other, even when it's hard." He glanced back at Ethan, nodding slightly. "And sometimes, faith looks like a young man standing up in a room full of adults and reminding us what really matters." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People nodded, some exchanging quiet glances with their neighbors, as if recognizing something in each other that hadn't been spoken before. Trump continued, his tone softer than before. "We live in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences. But faith? Faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing the same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths look. The gymnasium, which had earlier been filled with sporadic applause and political commentary, now felt like a sanctuary of shared reflection. This wasn't just about Trump speaking, it was about a collective moment of understanding. He took a step closer to the edge of the stage, his hands resting on the podium. "So, tonight, I'll leave you with this," he said. "Ask yourselves what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, even if you're not sure what it is yet. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing." For a moment the room held its breath, the weight of his words settling over them like a quiet prayer. Trump turned back to Ethan one last time, offering him a rare, genuine smile, and in that moment it was clear this night had left its mark on everyone. Faith had been questioned, tested, and, in its own quiet way, reaffirmed. As the applause faded, the room remained charged, not with admiration, but with connection. People who had entered as strangers now exchanged nods, handshakes, and quiet words of comfort. It was a rare moment, one that didn't need grand speeches or loud declarations. Something had shifted, something deeper than politics. Trump stepped away from the podium, making his way toward Ethan, who still stood by the microphone, his notebook clutched to his chest. The boy looked up as Trump knelt slightly, their eyes meeting. "Thank you, Ethan," Trump said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Never stop asking questions." Ethan swallowed hard but held his gaze. With quiet confidence he extended his small hand. Trump took it firmly, shaking it as if sealing an unspoken promise. "Thank you, Mr. President," Ethan replied, "for answering." As Trump turned back toward the stage, Ethan's mother pulled him close, squeezing his shoulder. He looked up at her, whispering, "Grandpa would have been proud, wouldn't he?" She smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "More than proud, sweetheart. He would have been amazed." The gymnasium slowly began to empty, people lingering as if reluctant to leave. Tonight had not been about politics or policy, it had been about faith, humanity, and the quiet wisdom of a child. The story of Ethan's question and President Trump's response teaches a profound lesson about the power of faith, courage, and human connection. It reminds us that faith is not about having all the answers, it's about believing even in uncertainty. Throughout the evening, people from different walks of life shared their struggles, doubts, and personal losses, revealing a truth we often overlook. Everyone carries silent battles, and faith is what helps us move forward. Ethan, despite being the youngest in the room, displayed wisdom beyond his years. His simple yet powerful analogy, "faith is like planting seeds," resonated deeply, showing that belief often requires patience and trust. His question challenged not only the president but an entire community, proving that sometimes the most unexpected voices hold the greatest truths. The story of Trump's late brother reinforces the idea that even the strongest individuals struggle with doubt and loss, and that faith is not about perfection but about perseverance, about climbing the ladder even when we can't see the top. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Faith, in its truest form, is about trust, resilience, and the willingness to keep believing even when the path is unclear.